All right, and welcome to another awesome episode of the Texas Podcast. I'm your host, BSD Bandit, along with...
Understudy 77.
Ow!
Dude, how you doing tonight? How excited are you for tonight? Like, are you fanboying?
I am fanboying, whatever, all over the place. I'm super amped for this episode. I'm truly a fan of this guy's work. I'm just
do me a
super
favor,
excited.
clean yourself up afterward, will you?
I sure will. And put a dong for that one. I mean, put the sound out. Let's go.
There you go.
Yes.
And so I'm not. We're not even going to mince words. We won't even hit with the talk. We'll dive right into it. It's a very special guest tonight. Many of you will know him differently than I know him. Personally, this is somebody that I've been on opposing sides with more times than I probably care to count. And he always makes my life very interesting. Without further ado, Mr. MG.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
We always start with like a, who are you? Why should people give a shit kind of thing. So, I mean, give us your story.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Well, I'll tell you who I am. I don't know why I should give a shit, but I guess I do some hardware stuff on the side. People like that. Usually offensive oriented. My day job, red teaming, and that's as of about 2 years ago. Prior to that, I was like IT generalist, jack of all for smaller companies. You know, that meant help desk management, sysadmin, like facilities, literally everything, right? So that kind of prepped me in ways I didn't really understand until I got into red teaming for red teaming. And it's there's a lot of stories there. But yeah, I guess that's who I am. And yeah, I should probably put some like concrete things down there in terms of the hardware stuff, like the O.M.G cable, O.M.G offensive. That's one thing, or like the Demon Seed, you know, the that type of stuff is probably what I am most well known for. So O.M.G cable being the USB cable that looks just like the real thing, and you know, can attack a computer with keyboard injection. Fun stuff.
You know, it's funny. I was telling my wife about this before we started recording a couple minutes ago, and I told her what you do. I was like, I got to pick up one of these things because I've never owned one of these cables. I'm like,
give me your address, man.
I appreciate that. But she goes, if you own that, I will never accept another cable from you ever. And like that was her response.
That is kind of that's an issue at home here too. So the problem is actually a little bit different. It's more that like every cable in the house is, I don't know, I'm sorry. Which is actually, it's funny because I made like a detector device. I'm gonna pull it out, even though it's not super visual, but it's just this. Where's my camera? Little thing. You plug it in and it glows red, right? And it tells you if it's a bad cable, right? And it's funny because I didn't realize until like this problem came up that I had effectively solved this with like my manufacturing rigs to make these cables, right? Like I've got little rigs that program and test and do all this stuff, right? I do it, the factory does it. Well, you know, how do you detect when a cable is plugged in? You got to detect that the malicious cable has been plugged in, right? So, you know, I took it, I just got it right out of there, stuck it in the detector, and boom. Now, you know, I'm like, here you go. Here is your solution. You plug this in, and it will tell you if the cable is one of the horrible cables that got lost.
I say this with entirely and completely with love, but I do kind of love that you made the problem and then made the solution as well. And
yeah. It's a very, very Lord of War kind of vibe going on. So
there you go.
So for the uninitiated, before we dive into like your backstory a little bit, let's talk about like the O.M.G cable and like what it is and what it does for anybody who might not know.
Yeah, definitely. So ignoring all the history and like how I got to be in, you know, making the O.M.G cable.
Oh, we're going to get to that part.
Yeah, exactly. We'll just go. What is the O.M.G? So it looks identical to take a pic of whatever that USB cable is, right? And you know, I'm gonna pull one out of the bag because I got one right near me. You know, this one would be like the Apple Lightning cable, right? This is blue protective stuff to prevent scratches. But yeah, you got Lightning on one end, USB on the other end, And it's down to like the fraction of a millimeter that I made everything fit into this. And in that USB-A connector, I've got a circuit board that allows the attacker to wirelessly connect to the cable, push payloads to it. And these payloads are keyboard injection based. So Hack 5 made famous the USB rubber ducky, right? That attack. And yeah, I mean, you can push them remotely. There's a lot of really cool like anti-forensics things in there of like, let's self-destruct it. Not physically. That's a legal problem that I don't want to get into. But it erases the payloads. Playing with a lot of different ways in which that network connectivity can be extended for infinite lengths, infinite distances. It's really good not only for the offensive use, but it's very good for awareness training. A lot of people pick those up to kind of show them off and show that there's risks to plugging things into your computer.
Sure. So I mean, let's talk about that too. Like, let's simplify it one step further. What are the kind of risks? Like, what are the kind of payloads that you can drop on one of these cables, and what can you get back or do to a target device or phone?
Yes, good point. What is keyboard injection, right? So so it's literally like you give me a keyboard and I plug it into your computer and I just type really fast effectively, right? So usually what those types of things look like is open up your terminal and doing whatever. Like, it's literally, I've got a keyboard at your computer, and as long as I can navigate with a keyboard, we're good. So yeah, installing payloads, malware, backdoors, exfiltrating your passwords, whatever it may be, whatever data is on the machine. It's basically as if I was sitting at the keyboard of your machine. Everything. Not really much of a limit.
Good. It's good to kind of set that part aside up front so people really understand what it is that we're talking about.
Yes.
So, and you're right, the rubber ducky being kind of a very famous tool for this, but also like a relatively kind of big-ish tool for this. Like,
your cables looks like a thumb drive.
Yeah. Your cables are pretty much indistinguishable from a cable that somebody would like plug in, like a lightning cable or any other type of cable. Basically almost impossible to tell the difference without an, MG, OMG cable detector. Again.
Yep.
But like that brings a whole different kind of level of risk associated with it too, though, because they're easy to drop, they're easy to sneak into a place, they're easy to do all this other stuff with, right?
Yes.
It's really easy to get somebody to use one.
Yes, and that was kind of the key thing, is a lot of the hardware gadgets for offensive security, they're designed to be like deployed by the attacker. Like, you walk in and as the attacker and you plug it into the computer and you take it out, walk away. There's a few exceptions where, like, you assault a parking lot with a thumb drive and you tag it as like salaries.xls, and then you hope somebody plugs it in. But there's already that suspicion of like, this is a foreign device, and I wanted to skip over that whole thing. I want something like, like stuff like Stuxnet. That attack was amazing, where it's like they don't know that they just brought some shit in, right? So I wanted to look identical. So, an evil mate attack where, maybe the attacker swaps out something and it looks identical. And then, now the victim has the target has the cable just with them constantly. It's funny because I gave these cables out to a bunch of friends and stuff like that, and there's quite a few people who were like, crap, dude, I've been using this to charge my phone for like the last week and I totally forgot that this was the cable. I'm like, yes, success. And it's like, they work in offensive security too. It's like, it's perfect, right? So and yeah, I've had a lot of feedback. Somebody actually who's blind was a customer. They picked this up and they're like, this is amazing. I can't feel a difference. I'm like, that's perfect, right? Like, and that guy eventually joined on, and he's now a member of like the small OMG collective working on offensive tooling. So you're probably going to see some interesting things from him soon.
Sweet.
That's awesome. All right. So before we dig into because I definitely want to dig into like how this stuff happens.
Yeah.
But before we dig into that, it might be prudent to back up a little bit now that we've talked about what this stuff can do, and talk about like, you went from sysadmin 2 years ago or so into like straight up red teaming, but like, how the hell do you get into hardware? Like that feels like one of those things like malware, like a lot of these other topics that just are so far like out of reach for people. So like break that down and like talk about how you even get into something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, through a lot of my history, being a sysadmin, you got basic hardware skills like building a computer. It's like, buying somebody else's hardware and slamming it together. It's, it's all modular, but, you kind of get a feel for how basic things work. I'm going to plug my headphones back in. You get a feel how that stuff works. And, my God, you're going to have to chop this one. I am too animated with my hands.
That happens.
Yeah, so I've had a lot of other kind of general experience of like, how do we turn on light bulbs with a battery, stuff like that, right? Like, yeah, okay, cool, right. I can take a 9-volt battery, but never got into like how a lot of the individual components and like an individual circuit work, right? If I pull out, some random thing which got a bunch of little components that are like, what do they all do? And you can kind of get a rough idea. I'm like, oh, that looks probably like an antenna. That's about as far as it went. But like you say, there's that kind of, I don't know, mythology almost around hardware where it's like this thing that's hard and difficult, which adds to it. But it's also physical and visceral, right? Like software doesn't have that. Like it's just this thing, but you touch it, you hold it, you see it, and that adds this certain, like, the way people perceive it. So this all kind of goes back to, God, was it I think it was 2017. I just saw a picture of somebody with a thumb drive. The clamshell was kind of broken open, and there was a firecracker inside, right? Like, I have no idea if it worked, but you see that, and just about anybody who sees it, like, oh shit. You have like a visceral reaction. I'm like, I like that. I like that reaction, right? I'm like, I want to make that, but I want to cross it with a USB rubber ducky. So I want a rubber ducky so you get the exploding drive, you got a rubber ducky, let's slam them together so that you can have a payload deploy. And one of the things you can do is, open a browser, go to a web page, things like that. I wanted to open it up, browser, like play a Jack in the Box, just cranking, right? And I just want that drive to explode, right? Like, okay, but how do I do that, right? Like, it's probably possible. How do I do that? And at the time, I was like, okay, I gotta figure out how to like shrink a rubber ducky, right? Like, I was trying to like mill, like take a Dremel and like, it was horrible. It was bad. I started Googling around, and there's like this Arduino space where people are playing with microcontrollers, but it's made much easier. Cause, you've got this little IDE and where you can do very basic things like turn on LEDs, turn them off, and you can go much more complex, but it's made to be much more accessible. So I found this kind of ecosystem and realized that people are using a fairly small microcontroller to bit bang what the Hack 5 Ducky did. Now, bit banging is basically you have a controller, a microcontroller, right? It's got a bunch of pins on there. Send data in and out of this pin. Turn it on, turn it off. On is, giving it voltage. Off is sending it ground, right? So high, low. A lot of times, USB is going to be a dedicated microcontroller that's like, it's built around communicating USB, but you don't actually have to do that for everything. You can just use code on this microcontroller to turn those pins on and off fast enough and in the right way that it looks like USB. There's a whole lot of USB. So specifically what I'm talking about here is a keyboard. Keyboards are great because they're really basic, pretty slow. It's like one of the slowest USB devices out there. So from the complexity standpoint, it's easier. Anyway, really back kind of the point here is I realized that these microcontrollers are pretty small and you can strip things way down, just start removing all the, we don't need LEDs, we don't need all these other things on there. And I shrunk it down to I can't remember the exact size, but it was like, like the size of a pill, effectively, right? And I'm like, sweet, I got this thing that acts like a poor man's rubber ducky, right? It was slow, it barely had any storage space for the payload, but it was enough to pop a browser and go to this thing. Like, cool, now I need to use another pin to effectively, actually, you're going to like this. I use like a nichrome wire, right? So I'm like,
Okay.
how do I ignite this? I'm like, oh, I could use like model rocket igniters and stuff. Like, no, nichrome wire. And effectively, you send power to this nichrome wire, it heats up, right? Boom, there's your igniter. Probably shouldn't be going into too much depths here. Here's how to build a bomb. But most of this data is kind of already out there.
Move past that one, but yeah, I mean that's all accessible, right?
Exactly. But so basically, you would do that, and once the payload was done, it would light up the nichrome wire, and it took a little firecracker, and I stuffed a bunch of confetti in there, right? And I'm like, yeah, I got this thing done. Like, I had no idea. This is what I saw. I want to just like inflict this upon the world, right? Like, here's a thing. Look at it, and it was super well received. I'm like, that's cool. All right, well, whatever. I had my fun, right? And I was in IT at the time, doing my IT stuff. It was just like fun side project. Took me, I don't know, I think it was like a month of like weekends just screwing around.
Right.
And I was just manually soldering wires together. And it was a pretty simple circuit. I think we're talking like maybe 8 total components, really basic stuff. And it was a couple of months later, I realized, wait a second, I got a really tiny USB rubber ducky. Like, I could probably do more than just make shit explode. Like, what could I do? Right. And I was just bouncing around Amazon, and I noticed these like USB repair connectors. Like, it's really chunky, it's really big, but it's meant to be. It's like, man, if you, I don't have any around here, but it's a really chunky USB connector with like the little housing on it. Like, nobody would believe it, but it's got the shape, right? Actually, funny enough, if you look up the USB Ant catalog. I did that. I noticed this recently. The cottonmouth cable they have in there, they use the same enclosure like shape, at least in the rendering, right? It's like this huge chunky thing. Anyway, I took the little tiny ducky that I made, stuffed it in like the cable housing, added a cable to it. I'm like, cool. Now I got a USB cable that's a ducky. That's cool because people don't expect it. Pass charge and all this stuff. Didn't do data at the time, so it wasn't like a real cable, but it's enough for a proof of concept, and showed that off. People loved it. I'm like, shit, I had people ask me to make them one and stuff like this, but at the time, I'm like, nah, this is a fun little side project. This is not like a thing worth selling. Some people did basically effectively sell that for absurd amounts of money. And I'm like, what the why are you doing this? So, whatever. In between, as I left my last job, I took 2 months off before picking up this red team job, right? And I'm like, you know what? I want to actually learn hardware, right? Oh, a lot of my education isn't very formal in nature. It's not, typically what you think. Like, I love software. Here. Yeah, right. And like,
I love informal education. It's like my favorite thing in the world. And I love stories of people who come from informal education because it gives hopefully everybody else in the world with informal education hope.
Right. Exactly. Right. And I don't really learn. I don't absorb the information in a lot of the formal settings. Like
I'm the same way, man. I get it.
Everything's backwards.
You gotta kind of do right. Like,
yes,
listening doesn't work. Like I'm one of those people. I need to interact. Like I need to talk.
Yes,
touch it.
Yes, part of it. Touch it. You gotta break it. You gotta I saw the light bulb turn on. I literally I connected to the battery. Like, now I know how it works.
And you never forget it.
Yeah, I'm a shit student, so like totally get it.
The problem is with hardware, like there's things like breadboards and whatnot where you can move wires around, but it's not it doesn't go quite as far as I needed it for full hardware design. Like I wanted to learn how to make a PCB, get the layouts, all this stuff, right? And like that's because that's what you need to get closer to a product. Well, that's real fucking hard to do when these things if you're gonna farm it out, it's probably like $50 to $100 per attempt. You can get it a little bit cheaper, but still, and it takes like a couple weeks per attempt. I'm like, man, I need to fail a lot. Like, I want it to be like code, where you're like, no, I'm going to change this line. I don't even know what it does, but it looks like maybe if I just yank it or modify it, something will happen. Well, you hit compile, 2 seconds later, you see what happened. You either undo it or you keep going. I needed that, right? I'm like, how do I do that? Started looking around at like how do people fabricate PCBs, and what we're talking about here in a PCB is just the raw copper traces on a board without any of the components on it. then you solder the components on. So I'm talking about just making that PCB that, it's typically green and,
just your copper lining.
Exactly. Right. And then I don't have it here, but basically I found a used mill, like a little desk. It's like 1 cubic foot. It's a mill. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but it was also intended for a PCB. So you take a really tiny like engraving tip, and it just cuts off. I don't have any boards. Man, I didn't bring anything. But anyway, you can buy copper clad PCB. So it's like resin and epoxy layer with like a foil of copper glued to 2 sides, right? Okay. So what you do is then you engrave out the areas you don't want to be copper, and then you've got traces left over. So that was kind of the basics of it. And I kept pushing that and seeing how detailed I could get. And I got quite a few prototypes. Like I got all the way to like production grade prototypes in terms of like, this is the model. Now I wouldn't sell stuff I made off my mill, but it's like, okay, I got this exact model of what I need in the cable. Now I can send that off to, a PCB manufacturer to fab it, and then that took another 10, 20 times until it actually worked out right, because there's so many layers to learn here. But that's kind of what happened.
Learn some of those concepts? Like what kind of resources did you use to learn the concepts, even figure out how to start this?
Yeah, I mean, just loads of Google, it was just so much Google, like, DIY PCB. You find a lot of really good resources like Hackaday, lots of really good collections, lots of communities like that. When I had made the kind of hand done, like, the Mr. Self-Destruct was the name I gave to the exploding drive. I don't think I said that. I'm a big Nine Inch Nails fan. So, that's where that came from. But
it's so punk rock. I love it.
So when I had been putting Mr. Self-Destruct inside of these cables, Joe Fitzpatrick noticed, and he's like, hey, come and, he pulled me into his world of hardware security. And, next thing I know, I'm like on a stage at B-Sides Portland with like Kim Zetter and, Joe Grand. There's a lot of names that were on this stage, and I'm up there like, wow, the fuck am I next to these people, talking about this stuff? And, Joe was talking about how he's going to get a mill to do this stuff to teach in class. I'm like, I should get a mill, and you start getting exposed to more and more people, and it's just kind of like community shared knowledge. And honestly, I took some of Joe's classes too. This was I don't know, 2-ish years ago, and I picked up a lot of things in his class about hardware security in general, and that eventually he bought some of the exact same mills almost the exact same day that I was buying my mill, and he turned those into a class on how to rapid prototype, right? And I ended up helping him in those classes and helping teach these classes with him. So it was just this thing that kind of evolved. And I can't pinpoint any single thing, but there are a lot of people, a lot of resources. Just go get it, right? Like, I'm very fortunate in many ways too. Like, if Joe didn't reach out to me and say, hey, come hang out at, God, it was a couple DEF CONs ago. He's like, swing by the hardware meetup. I'm like, what? And, looked up who Joe was. Like, oh shit, I better go. It was cool. So not a very concrete, discrete answer for you. It's a mess.
But I think it provides some decent resources, and that's a good place to be. So I mean, continue on the story. This is a
definitely
wonderful story.
Yeah. So during that 2-month break, pretty much worked like 20 hours a day, just fully absorbed in this thing. Like, I'm gonna make this work. And my goal at the time was like, I want the cable, the ducky in a cable, but I want it to have a wireless interface so that I can not only remotely trigger, but remotely push a payload to it, so that you could get this cable in the target's hands and do, your red team, you get it. Things change, right? So
rapidly.
You want to be able to take that info and then modify it and then push it to the cable that's already in play. I wanted that, right? I'm like, if I can do that, like, that's some like, NSA grade shit, right? That is good. That's, that was my target. Like, but I also had the goal. It had to be a perfect match to Apple's cable, because Apple's design, I love a lot of their physical designs. It's great.
Right.
Theirs was the hardest for me because it's the smallest, it's the leanest. There's no extra margins. Like, if you can put it in the Apple cable, you can put it in all the other cables, at least of the Type A style. Because, I had so many different types of boards that were much bigger. And it's like, yeah, sure, if you want a chunky cable, most people will be like, that's great, it's a cable. If you're just saying, this looks like a cable, right? And you're like, yeah, it fucking looks like a cable. Like, oh, cool, it detects. Crazy. It's like, no, man, I want it to look like your cable, and you don't even know it's not your cable until it's attacking, right? So, that was my goal. And then in the span of 2 months, hacked something together. It barely worked. Like, it overheated, but it was enough. It was enough to, like, it's a demo. It worked. And my idea at the time was, like, I want this to be an entirely DIY open source thing. And the closer I got to, like, realizing, like, it making it real, I started to realize how much harder it was to properly DIY. Like, it was already really fucking hard. And at some point, God, so it was like 2 months in, I got the initial thing out. My goal, let me put some months on this for timing. I started in December, finished in February. And, that's also, like, literally the day later is when I started my dude job. And I'm like, you know what? This worked. People like this. I want to get a handful of these ready for DEF CON, right? And, okay, seems reasonable. Another 6 months out. That barely, dude. I was still making these in the hotel room, literally the nights before, like hair dryers and stuff. But once I got to that point, I realized how hard, in a DIY setting, like, I'm making these from the ground up by hand. It took me at least 4 hours per cable to make them, and 50% of them did not work. Like, I just trash them, right? So that's a significant time investment. I'm like, there's no way you can open this and, like, oh, just DIY. Literally, the only people that are going to do that are the people who know how to manufacture these, and they're just going to sell it for profit. I'm like, I'm going to do it. So I kind of just, at that point, dropped everything. I'm like, let's get rid of the whole, like, ease of access thing and just see how much more I can chase this. And, that's starting to bring us closer to today, because that was, I released this, it was about 2 years ago now. And I just want to keep pushing. I'm like, okay, if it doesn't have to be DIY, how much more can I push? And that's when we got into, like, putting keylogger capabilities inside of this cable, which it's a different physical cable, but, that's another feature. Like, can we squeeze that in there? And there's a lot of different types of cables out there that are much smaller, and let's see if we can push into that territory. There's just a lot of efficiencies. And honestly, another interesting aspect is, once I made that decision, like, this isn't going to be DIY, we're going to somehow get these produced. I think I sold like 30 of them, fully hand-built ones, at DEF CON. And it's like, dude, I'm not going to spend 8 hours per cable. Like, it just, like, I think I was selling them for, it was like $200, right? And that's like nothing compared to the 8 hours that went into that. And just the blood, sweat, and tears, like, literally all of them. And God, learning how to get into the manufacturing side of that was so much more work at the same time. Like, you're learning so many different things. Like, what I can do with my hands.
Oh, yeah. That stuff is also fascinating.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I actually spent a lot of time in. Like, I know a lot of people who are in manufacturing.
Right.
So, like, I spent a lot of time, like, learning manufacturing and the challenges of manufacturing, and how fucking hard it is, and how expensive it is to manufacture. Depending on batch size and depending on where you're making it, and, like, if you're manufacturing in the US. And, like,
exactly.
so many things that go into manufacturing that people don't think about. They just go, oh yeah, I'm not going to pay $100 for that thing.
Right. And you're like, dude, what?
You don't understand that it was made on a $450,000 machine.
Exactly.
By a person who has to get paid, and they're basically all cranking time.
Right.
And I mean, so for anybody who doesn't know, if I can give a manufacturing thing, I'll sidetrack.
Yeah, do it.
Manufacturing costs basically come from, like, cost of items come from taking the cost of the machine, because none of these machines are owned outright, the cost of the labor, and then figuring out if we can produce this many at any given time, this is what we have to sell them for. And then they have to go to retail, and then they get marked up from a retail perspective.
Right. Yep.
So you're not like getting ripped off. Like there's actually a mathematical equation to manufacturing that figures out what a fair price is based on what they have to make just to continue to quantify the machine.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
Using other people. Like a little fun side note on manufacturing, because that's something a lot of people don't know. And anyway, continue.
Yeah. I mean, God, it's a great point. I'll touch on costs, honestly, because that's an important thing. Is Hack 5 Darren? He actually lives pretty close to me. I didn't realize that until 2 years ago at DEF CON. He's like, yeah, swing by my booth, and yeah, you can distribute them there. And it was great for him because you got a bunch of foot traffic coming over. Oh, yeah. But I think that showed him like the interest in it. I mean, showed me too. But I think that's when he decided to help me out, because I had been looking around for somebody to teach me how to make this not my problem. Like I need to give it to other people, like so I can do other things. And yeah, he fronted the initial capital to get this done. Like I had no money. I had like the bonus that I got from my new job, and that pretty much entirely went into the R&D efforts, right, to get to this point. And he fronted the money for the cables, and man, there were so many issues. It took another, I don't know, like 8 months of back and forth with overseas and all these different manufacturers to get things where they needed to be. Because turns out what I can do with my hands is not necessarily what someone else can do with their hands when it's bulk. It's also not something a machine can do entirely. Right. You have to design the assembly and everything.
So that it accepts machine language rather than by hand.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can go in there and like hold things together while it's gluing. They're like, dude, no, like I'm not holding a cable for 4 hours. If you want me to make 1,000. So it's like, okay, cool. You have to go through a whole bunch more revisions, and then you test them, and you're like, oh, turns out I had to shrink that board by another, I think it was like 30%. I'm like, oh, dude, it's already really tiny. But figured it out, and got it through, and man, the first batch of cables, 40% failed. 40%. I'm like, oh, dude, like, Darren, what are we gonna do? Like, we can't do this. Oh, he's like, man, this is hardware, right? I'm like, what are you talking about? Now I get it, right? Now I was like, yeah, okay, but yeah, there's so many costs added on, and that first run, I luckily the initial desire to make everything DIY meant that the technical requirements for like bulk production was relatively low. So the cost was relatively low. Now that, that first wave went out, it barely paid for itself. Took some of the profits, threw it right back into R&D, and suddenly, wait a second, I can afford the next batch and much more expensive R&D. Like I'm at the point now where I think like a single test PCB, if you're like, here's my design and I want to test it, like to send that off to fab, like the bare minimum cheapest is right around $50, right? Like, there's sales and other things, but $50, right? For a single one. Now scale changes, right? And if you're like, oh, I want 100, it's much bare minimum, right? So $50 per word, they can turn that around in like 24 hours. Now, I'm at the point where literally just this week I got back a PCB that cost, for a single unit, would have cost $1,000, and it took them 2 months to make because of the technical requirements are so much higher. And it's like I couldn't have done this, but the ability to keep kind of doing stepping stones of like, okay, that worked. Right. Now just keep going, and throwing all the money right back into R&D has been its own unique thing. Like I'm learning so many different supply chain things, so many different just manufacturing and business logistics, and it's been a huge learning experience. A lot of interesting things even along the way with like supply chains you learn from about a security perspective, right? The cable manufacturer, like the last step before it comes into my hands, they're the ones who put the PCB inside of the cable, and they lost a few hundred of them. Like they just lost it, and not entirely sure where it ended up, but they didn't have them sitting in any corner of the warehouse. So my guess is it went out to another customer. And like, nobody knows. So I mean, that's a testament to how accurate the reproduction is. Not even the manufacturer knows which one's the bad ones. But you start to learn things like that, and that changes a bunch of stuff. Like it's like I don't want to be programming these and making them hot right off the assembly line. It's like no,
Right.
I want to take it, put a whole QA pass on them, and make them armed when I get them, and things like that. So.
Well, you also have the risk of like competitors picking stuff up like that.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Amazon got hit for that a lot recently, of like making people tell them who's manufacturing their stuff and then going to that manufacturer and making cheap knockoffs.
Yep,
or making knockoffs. Like that's a big thing. Like it happens a lot, especially when you do like overseas manufacturing. Like,
yes,
it's a big deal.
Yes,
because there's not necessarily loyalty there, right? Business is business.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So, like, they'll make your shit for somebody else and just stick a different brand on it if they want or whatever too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that could have very well been one of the things that happened.
Yeah.
Like maybe somebody's like, well, man, these OMG cables, I'm going to toss them on. So far, those haven't turned up because thanks to the design of my process, probably, would have quickly found that out.
Yeah.
So if we can, anything else on that story, I want to dive into like the functionally like how USB kind of works to make this happen, because I think that'll be
totally. Let's dive into keystroke injection. What is that, right?
Yeah, cool. Let's do that, and then like how you make that work on USB, because like with pre-show, and everybody always gets mad when I talk about pre-show. You were talking about like figuring out like this pin does this and this pin does, and like all that, and that stuff's fascinating. And I'd love to like deconstruct that down to a consumable idea, right? So,
yeah, definitely. So USB has at its core 4 lines, right? The most simple USB. We're not talking about USB 3, USB-C, or anything like that. We're just talking about 4-pin USB here. It's got 2 lines dedicated to power, data. So you get 5 volts and ground, right? And then you got the two middle ones, which are your data pins, D plus and D minus. And for the most part, it's a differential signal, which simply means they're always opposing each other. So when one line is high, the other's low, right? So effectively, we're going to kind of gloss over a few things here, but basically, you've got a single line that's going high, low, high, low, high, low, right? With a very specific timing and a very specific speed, and it also has to receive data. So that's that's how we transmit, but we'll also want to receive data of the same format. So that's the core of really any data comms pathway, right? Now, keystroke injection effectively says, I am a keyboard, and here are some keystrokes, right? That's and then as an attacker, I can do a whole lot with a keyboard plugged into your computer. But how does that work at the low level? Now, you can get lots of little microcontrollers and components. Some are dedicated to USB. It's like, some will act exactly like a keyboard. Like if you open up a keyboard, it's gonna have a microcontroller in there that's sending these signals. But these things take space. And if you get a Hack 5 rubber ducky, their thumb drive, there's a lot of components on there. They're doing full speed USB, which is a little faster than what I do. Now, the cool thing is with microcontrollers, or kind of general purpose, you push code to these things, and they got a whole bunch of pins. Typically, for the most part, let's just focus on the fact that a lot of these pins are data pins. So they can turn high, they can turn low, and you can also turn them into an input pin. So you can receive data or signals on that. So with USB, honestly, for pretty much any other comms, you can bit bang it. So bit banging means via software, you're turning a pin on and off, high, low, with a very specific pattern and a very specific timing that looks on the line identical to, like a hardware implemented USB. And with my stuff, that's what I'm doing, because the more stuff you can shove into a single microcontroller, the less physical space it requires, right? So if you can teach a single microcontroller to do all the other things that typically it's way easier to just glue another like 10-cent component on the board, obviously you're going to go that path unless you're constrained by size, or if you're trying to really chase margins and you're like, 10 cents is going to ruin me. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. And there's a lot of open source things out there. VUSB is an example of that. You just Google that. And there's a chip called an AT-Tiny, really popular, really cheap, very common. You can find it in like DigiSparks, and there's so many things in this like Arduino space that you can find an AT-Tiny, and you take VUSB and you load it onto this really God, what's an AT-Tiny? They're probably like 50 cents or so. And like a DigiSpark, which is kind of like a fully assembled, ready to go board with an AT-Tiny that you plug into a USB port to interface with it. They're like $3 to $5, right? So really cool. But that's not what I'm using in my cable. This is a good example. If you wanted to experiment yourself, like go get like a DigiSpark and download via USB, and now you can open up Arduino IDE, for instance, and you've got this whole interface. You're like, okay, I want it to type X, Y, and Z. It's fairly easy to do. You compile it, push it to it, go. And that is the foundation of the very first like proof of concept I made. It was based around an AT-Tiny. And when I made that decision to drop the OMG cable DIY effort, I decided to resurrect that AT-Tiny and make it its own thing. And I called this the Demon Seed. It meant to be like a Prius, exactly right. Demon Seed, for the record, also a Nine Inch Nails song. It's about getting tiny, and it just seemed like it was very implanty in nature. There's obviously other which he referenced that name. I think is the reference to the movie. I've never watched it, but it's all about Nine Inch Nails, right? So anyway, that Demon Seed, I just took an AT-Tiny and a very few components that are needed, and stuck it on these little tiny PCBs that are still, you can interface with it like with a soldering iron and stuff like that. That it goes back to that DIY thing.
Right.
So, I've released an entire like a series of YouTube videos, right, where I kind of walk through like, hey, here's how to install VUSB and get a basic payload, and start playing around with other things, because I have noticed that, like you mentioned, like hardware is like this huge hurdle, right? You look at it, but I have talked to a lot of, especially software like engineers. I talk to a lot of them, and I kind of show them some really low level fundamentals, and suddenly something just clicks in their head. I'm like, I love that. I love seeing that and showing some really primitive, basic things you can do. And that's kind of a lot of the motivation behind this Demon Seed project is, what else can you do? What other super primitive things can you do? Like, what about RF, right? Do we need an entire radio module? Like, that's the RF is voodoo, right? Like, there is people who do RF don't even entirely know how it works half the time. But like, hey, can we get some like really primitive RF behavior here, like garage door remote like style stuff? And another thing a lot of these microcontrollers can do, they have something called an ADC, analog to DC converter. Effectively, it takes a variable voltage and converts it to a numeric value. So 0 to 124 effectively. And if you stick a wire on there, you can actually charge that wire with some powerful nearby radios, and you know what? You got a really primitive RF trigger suddenly that we can add to this Demon Seed. Cool. Here's another thing. USB, if you want to share a port between two devices, there's two ways by spec to do this. Like, you can't just tie these data lines together and go, right? Like, it's going to collide. It's not going to work. You either need to have a physical switch that cuts from one to the other, like it's effectively unplugging and plugging the other one in, or you need a hub. Everybody knows a hub, right? So that's more components. More components, also more space, more complexity.
Right.
With the Demon Seed, I did some experimentation, like what is the bare minimum regardless of spec? Like, what can we do to take over a line and then release the line? And I haven't gotten to these videos yet, but it's effectively like we add one more resistor, and through some like really hacky approaches, you can kind of mute the downstream device. So if you're a cable, you're two devices. You're the implant and whatever's connected downstream. So it's like, well, how do we take that thing off? So, that's another thing. It's like, let's ignore the complexity of a hub and a switch and all this stuff. Let's go down to like one resistor. Let's physically look at what these lines are doing, like on an oscilloscope, for instance. An oscilloscope will visualize high-low, so you see that square of a square wave, and you can watch the voltages drop and play around with that, and you get this. I don't know. It goes back to like that visceral, tangible. Like I can touch it, I can see it, I can manipulate the thing, and people start picking it up. And when you're like, oh, I'm going to put one resistor down, and it changed this entire behavior, so much easier to pick up than other pathways. And from an offensive standpoint, it's really cool being able to say, like, this is the spec, this is what you need to follow, if you need to follow the spec, but you're making a device to attack, right? Like, fuck the spec.
Right.
Like, what can you do if you look at that spec? What are the things outside of it? Why can you make that spec break itself? Like we mentioned earlier on, like USB Type C. Everybody looks at that as this, oh, it's simple USB, works exactly like you think. It's just a different connector. It's like, no, dude. Just the power delivery on Type C is 600 pages. It's actually more now. The last time I looked, it was 600 pages. Just for power, just for sending power down that cable, or receiving it, or all the millions of different things you can do on Type C. And I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this, other than the fact that the spec is so big. I suspect there's going to be some attack surface that corresponds to the size of the spec.
Sure.
So you can probably do a lot of fun things if you look.
So that actually brings us to a cool thing to talk about for a minute, and that's, what are you willing to tell us about what's coming in the future? I know there's a beta right now for the keylogger variant.
Yeah.
Of the cable, but like what's coming down the pipe? Like, what are you working on that you're willing to share?
Yeah, definitely. So just to kind of summarize the keylogger portion, because I kind of skimmed over that. You take a USB cable and you add a keylogger inside of there. Now, a lot of people are like, "Oh, what's the point of that? Like, how's that work?" Well, the Apple Magic Keyboard, for instance, everybody looks at that as a Bluetooth keyboard, right? At least around the like San Francisco Bay Area, that thing is super ubiquitous, right? Like, it is everywhere, and it kind of just nullified the concept of a hardware keylogger, because it's like, what are you going to do, right? Like, it's really lean keyboard, and it charges over a lightning cable. And it also just does some like automatic pairing with Bluetooth when you plug it in over that. Another thing that happens is it uses that cable. It falls over to standard like USB HID protocol when it's plugged in. So it becomes just a standard USB keyboard at that point, which means you can log it over the USB cable. And, if you've got a keyboard you have to plug in to charge it, maybe once a month or whatever it is, that's a good opportunity to catch it. Or I've noticed a lot of people will leave those keyboards plugged in, especially if they have like that Thunderbolt monitor with the USB ports in the back. It's like, whatever, I'm used to having a keyboard with a cable on it. Why not just leave it in? So, a lot of opportunities there. Then I started looking, there's a whole lot of like, what do they call, like pro keyboards and, high-end keyboards. Mechanical keyboards especially, all of them are starting to use detachable USB cables. Yeah, exactly, right? Like, what does that use? Is that a micro USB, or is that Type C?
This is Type C, actually.
Yeah.
This is Type C.
Yep.
But it's Type C to Type A for mine, because I only have one USB-C port in the back of my computer.
Exactly. And it's like, cool. Well, your keyboard passes through that. So it's very niche. It's very, tailored. So if you need some tailored access, that's where that's where my concept of that cable. I'm like, I basically wanted a reason to make it, and that was the reason. And it's like, okay, cool. I keep throwing the money right back into R&D and just chasing. Who knows? Maybe down the line, like, I can afford the $1 million to do fab of my own silicon, but for now, stepping stones. And I'm like, how much more can I shrink this? What other form factors can I put it in? And there's a lot of requests for like, make it Type C and things like that. And yeah, I've played around with Type C, and like I said, huge technical complexities. not just the size. Like a lot of people are looking at it and they're like, oh, I'm going to use Type-C to evade your cables because you can never fit it in there. I'm like, fitting it's not the problem. There's a whole bunch of other things. So, if we get that solved, keep that in mind. Also working on non-cable, but who knows, maybe it'll become a cable, project with another crew. We kind of started doing this independently of each other. I won't say too much other than this is a novel technique that is for, well, one aspect of what this could be used for is exfiltrating data, not necessarily. But if you combine this with something like a ducky or an OMG cable, maybe it's even more powerful. You get the feedback loop, kind of like maybe the Keystroke Hack5's keylogger product, where it was funny. They're the first to take keylogging and combine it with keyboard injection. Now, we had been working on the keylogger thing for a year and a half, but it takes a long time to implement it on these tiny chips because we're going from the ground up. But they were the first to do it, and this is really powerful concept of you log what they're typing. Maybe it's your admin password, whatever it is, and maybe you can update a payload. So, for instance, I'm trying to think of a good example here. There are certain conditions where you can very predictably detect that someone has entered a password. If there's been a long wait period, or if the line they just typed before it said sudo, and then they hit enter, and then they type another string and hit enter, well, it's probably a password. And there's a lot of things you can deduce from this and pipe it right back into a payload that you then play later on, like wait till 2 a.m, unlock their machine, because they're responsible that every time they get up from their machine they lock it, right? Cool, whatever. We got your password already. Now we just wait till 2 a.m, log into your machine, do whatever you want, done, right? So there's that approach, is really cool, of combining multiple attacks into single hardware packages, and I'm kind of chasing that right now in conjunction with another crew. So we'll see what happens there. It's a novel technique. Don't know how far it'll go, but we're going to release it in a way that is, it's kind of like, I'm not going to spend like a year polishing it to put it in the cable and make it perfect. It's like, no, let's get the technique out there so people can play with it now in a more flexible format. And that'll be really cool to see what people do or don't do with it.
Yeah, that's super freaking cool.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So and we told you a little bit about this beforehand, but kind of as is our way, whenever we have a guest come on, know that we are known as detections for a reason. We always ask the guest to bring a detection or something that an individual can take back to their environment and use it to find badness or use it in some way that'll kind of up-level their skill set. We've talked a lot about hardware, and I mean, I'm sure you could go into a bunch of like novel red team techniques too, but we've talked a lot about hardware, and we always ask our guests to provide said detection. So what do you have for us tonight?
Yeah, I mean, so
other than like buying an OMG cable detector, that doesn't count.
So in terms of let's go basic with like the keystroke injection thing, right? So there are tools out there that can help detect somebody trying to do a keystroke injection attack. So one that comes to mind is USB guard, right? So that I'm gonna tell you this with several caveats though. The USB guard can detect vendor ID, product ID that a USB device will announce itself as. There's a few other things you can do. There's other attributes like that. How much you want to crank up the dial. That so you can effectively create like a whitelist that says these are the only ones that can be plugged into this machine. So here's my trusted keyboard. That goes in, and that would be a good thing to at least defend against, right? And you can run detections around that. Now, the caveat here is that there's no authentication around that. Even in the OMG cable, you can do it on the fly. If you know the vendor ID and the product ID, which you can, for the most part, you just go grab another keyboard, plug it in, or just Google it. A lot of them are going to be out there because a lot of them are registered. Like you cannot get a vendor ID. Is it the vendor ID or product ID? Maybe it's both. I forget. But these things are registered, right? Like you have to pay money to get the number, right? That's the idea. But there's no authentication, so you can using rubber ducky OMG cable, forge effectively like, the vendor ID and product ID and say, now I'm in. Maybe God, YubiKeys, right? Those are effectively keystroke injection, right? Like they're like, hey, let's type.
Yeah, that's
so
true. Yeah.
Maybe if you're a really secure org and you're running endpoint tools that detect this stuff, and I see that, maybe I'm just gonna spoof my vid and pid as a YubiKey.
Yeah.
I don't know. So
Possibly.
yeah.
But that's a good start, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
a good start to it, and to a very complex problem. And I think a lot of what you're doing is highlighting a very complex problem.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I hope tonight, for everybody who listened, like, we have helped kind of open your eyes to what is a very complicated problem and arguably a very realistic problem, especially with the hardware that's out, including your own. So
Yeah.
like, it makes it a very complex problem. So with that being said, like, where can people find you, find out more stuff about you? Like, drop your deets.
Yeah.
Just,
okay. So
un-OSINT yourself right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So website where I list like the little products I put together, o.mg.lol. mg.lol is the blog where I kind of occasionally post stuff. Throw a lot of stuff up on Twitter, which is _mg_. If you want to check me out there.
It's fantastic, dude. I just want to say too, like, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes.
This has been
it's been fun, man.
I fucking love how excited you are about this stuff. Like, every time I get the chance to talk to you, you're like BSD in a lot of ways, and that just fucking like injection of energy and excitement into like me.
BSD's got energy, man.
Like, it picked me right the fuck up though, and it's such like I love chatting with like you and BSD, because you just inject so much like excited energy into the fucking world, and I love it.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.
BSD, closing notes.
Oh my goodness.
I'll take us out, but what do you go for it? What do you got?
Once again, and I just want to say, you should have called it the Invisible Ducky.
Ooh, I like it.
There you go. Instead of the smaller ducky, no, Invisible Ducky.
At the time, I didn't know Darren, and I don't want to step in that territory.
No, I know that.
That's fair. We are the first product, I guess, to license Ducky script from Hack5 officially. Like,
oh wow, okay.
I'm proud of that. We did it right.
Yeah. There you go, man. But yeah, it's like I said, it's been a blast, and like I said, I learned something tonight about a 600-page piece. So why am I crying about an RFC that I'm reading? I'm just saying. So, but no, all in all, I think you're doing some awesome work. Please keep on doing it. Don't stop. And
thank you.
We definitely looking forward to future projects.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. Keeps me going.
All right.
Cool. With that, everybody, I want to remind you, especially after tonight, I want to remind you to go forth and find badness
in cables.